Nightshades, sadly, because I could talk about nightshades for hours and hours and hours, and you would probably all fall asleep, as people do, under the influence of nightshades. But I want to talk a bit about how description of biodiversity in a local area is important for us in a number of different ways. Now, we know we live on an absolutely beautiful blue and green planet, and having walked around Vancouver on Sunday, this has got to be the greenest place of all. So we live on a planet, we interact with all kinds of other different sorts of species, and although we humans tend to think of ourselves as apart from biodiversity, we're actually part of biodiversity. And I want to talk a bit about how that works this evening. Now, our species has always been interested in exploring. We have looked beyond our shores, beyond where we are, for millennia. And as the first Europeans set out from Europe to go and discover the rest of the world, of course other people had been in the rest of the world, but Europeans of course like to think that they're the first ones to do anything. We encountered new and interesting things. Now, one of my favorite first explorers is the mad, bad buccaneer, William Dampier. Now, Dampier circumnavigated the world 3 times, actually landed on Australia before anyone else did, and he made his living as a pirate, but he was a legal pirate, which meant he was authorized by the British Crown to sack all other ships. So that's what you do when you're a buccaneer. Now, from today's point of view, we think about maps and what the world looks like, and you can close your eyes and see that NASA picture of the globe, and you know the shapes of the continents. But imagine what it was like sailing out into the unknown, not knowing what you would find at the end of your journey. And this is a map of Japan, Borneo, and New Guinea, done in the 16th century. So they weren't too good at the shapes of the continents in those days. They also discovered interesting new things which defied the classification systems that they had at the time. So people knew the plants of Europe. Plants and animals of Europe had been studied by people for a very long time. Plants partly because all medicine was botany in those days. So it was really important for people to know the plants and know what they were and how to tell them apart, because your life, in a way, depended upon it. 150 years ago this year, this man, Joseph Banks, set out in Her Majesty's ship Endeavour to observe the transit of Venus. The transit of Venus is when Venus goes across the face of the sun, and this is watching and timing the transit of Venus is what allowed sailors to calculate latitude. So it allowed people to actually figure out where they were on the face of the Earth. Now, one of the other things that Banks did, he had closed instructions from the Crown. And one of the other things that Captain Cook and Banks were to look at was they were meant to go and discover the southern continent. So before Joseph Banks and after him Captain Flinders circumnavigated Australia, discovered that in fact was a large continental island, people thought that there had to be a massive sea of land on the southern part of the Earth to balance the land on the northern part, because otherwise it would tip over. So, I mean, it seems crazy to us now, but people really thought that. And at the time, 150 years ago, that's only not that long ago. That was not 250 years ago. Banks set out to see if this was in fact true. Now, concomitantly, and just before Banks went off in 1768 on the Endeavour, Carl Linnaeus was publishing about biodiversity, what we would call biodiversity today. And he said, if you do not know the names of things, then the knowledge of them is lost too. And this is one of the things that the explorers did when they went out exploring, is they would look for things and they would give them names. So they would give them new names. Now, we often think of that as being the science of taxonomy, of giving names to new taxa. But in fact, giving a name to something allows us to have a conversation about it. Because can you imagine people not having names? How could you ever talk about anyone else? How could we ever gossip? How could we ever do anything without having a name to call something? It starts a conversation. And Linnaeus also identified that names were a way of attaching knowledge to an object. so that all the knowledge could be attached to that name, and it was a kind of indexing system. Now, he published in 1753 the book Species Plantarum, which started the binomial system of naming that we use today for all plants and all animals. And this was something that he didn't impose on the rest of the world. It in fact caught on because it was sensible and easy to use. So the science of taxonomy can be said to have perhaps started with Linnaeus, but taxonomy today is much more than just naming things. We can think of taxonomy as being a three-parted endeavor. And I would characterize those three parts as being description, which means figuring out what objects, what units there are in nature, and what to call them. Identification, which is how you identify one and tell one from another. And then phylogeny, which is looking at the evolutionary relationships between those things. So without one of these, you can think of it as a three-legged stool. Without one of these, the entire stool falls over. So all three of these things are really essential to understanding the world around us. Now, taxonomists, like I am, there used to be thought that there would be a particular way of doing the work that we do. And you would start by writing a monograph. So a monograph means just what it says in Latin. It is something you write that has everything that you would ever possibly want to know about a particular subject in it. So people write monographs on art objects or on the Elgin marbles, and taxonomists, botanists write monographs on plants. From those monographs would be derived floras, which would be all the plants of a particular region. So you can think of a monograph as being something that's everything you wanted to know about one particular type of plants, in my case the nightshades, and a flora would be all of the plants of a particular region, like the province of British Columbia. And then from those floras would stream other things like field guides and today automatic identification guides and interactive guides. So the idea was that essentially you started with the in-depth study and then everything else flowed from that. Which meant, of course, that you needed to do a huge amount of work to do a monograph, which meant that people would work for their entire career, publish a monograph, and then none of the other things would get done, because they came second. And I'd like to argue that, in fact, that's the wrong way around to think of these things. These kinds of things, these are field guides to trees and ferns, which were written for use in the ferns in Paraguay and the trees in the Yucatan Peninsula, are things that are really important because they bring that science and a conversation about the diversity of life around us to everyone. It becomes in a language that isn't just for those people who know what they're talking about, but it actually is a language that everyone can speak. So in fact, I think the floras, monographs, and these derivative projects is much more of a virtuous circle, that each one informs the other, and doing them all at the same time actually makes each one of them better, because it's more about communicating with a broader set of people about the world around us. Now, this is one of the first great floras that was done in Central America, and when I first went to the Natural History Museum in London, I went to manage a huge project which is called Flora Mesoamericana, which is the flora of the last land bridge on Earth, which is from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico to the border with Colombia. There are about 20,000 species of flowering plants and ferns that live there. And this is the first of those efforts. The beetle volumes alone are 14 volumes in this fauna and flora of Central America. The butterflies are beautiful. The beetles were done by Alfred Russel Wallace. It was the magnum opus of its time. And one of the interesting things about this is that the man who did the botanical work, William Botting Hemsley, he worked out of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which is in London, and he never, not once, in the 16 years of him working on this flora, did he go up the road to the Natural History Museum, which is a mere 4 kilometers away, to consult the collections there. So collections are really important for producing this work. Because if we didn't have collections like the ones in the Biodiversity Museum, then we would have to start over again every time to catalog things that were in the world. So collections are, in a way, our collective memory, and they're a very important infrastructure. The Biologia Centrale Americana was beautifully illustrated. It was one of those books which was a classic of its time. And it treated all of Mexico and all of Central America, which is an enormous endeavor for that period of time. Today, instead of merely consulting collections, we also do field work. So in the field is where we are able to see plants and animals in their native state and to see how they're interacting with other species, and also see characteristics which disappear when they're kept in as museum collections. Field collection, of course, involves more than just wandering around and looking at plants. These are colleagues. I was not working that night. So colleagues pressing plants in Paraguay. And you can see it can be pretty difficult. Some of this stuff is very large and has a huge amount of time to prepare it. So preparing the plant specimens to be put into the museum is a time-consuming effort. It can also go seriously wrong sometimes. This is a plant dryer which I woke up one morning and saw flames coming out of the plant dryer, which wasn't good. We lost the plants. A friend of mine burned down a hotel in Mexico. I've never done that. So that's good, isn't it? So this was a bit of a disaster, but we saved the plants, which is the important thing. Now, the specimens that we collect are really important for a number of reasons. Not only are they evidence that something grew somewhere or lived somewhere at some time, they're also the way in which we can study morphology. And this is a quote from The Origin of Species from Charles Darwin. And the beginning bit is a bit boring, but the whole subject is included under the general name of morphology. This is the most interesting department of natural history and may be said to be its very soul. Now what he's talking about is the shapes, sizes, and characteristics of organisms, because it's through the bodies of organisms that they interact with their environment. And it's that Darwin was thinking about when he talked about morphology being the very soul of natural history, because for him, natural history is all of what we would today call the biological sciences. So those specimens are really important for us for the study of morphology. There's been a lot of talk recently about using short DNA barcodes to identify organisms, so we wouldn't have to look at organisms anymore. All we would have to do is kind of put our little phone thing up to it and kind of suck a little bit of juice out of it, and then give its DNA sequence and it would tell us what it was. But that neglects that whole thing which Darwin found so interesting, which was how organisms interacted with their environment and with other organisms. This is a pretty cool idea, though, in part because organismal life is organized in a very interesting way. If you look at the side, this is a slide I stole from my colleague Mark Blackster, who works at Edinburgh. If you look at the size range of organisms, there's a few, you can't really see it over here, but there's a few that are very big, which are possible predators. A few more are food items. But the vast majority of biodiversity, both in terms of numbers of organisms and numbers of taxa, are very, very, very small. Which means that identifying things with DNA for those organisms is probably extremely useful and will become hugely important and will cause an explosion in our knowledge of actually what kinds of biodiversity we share the planet with. But for tonight, we're going to talk about plants. And plants are big, and they have morphology, and we can actually see them, touch them, and they're not in that great big blob of tiny, tiny things. So we'll forget about DNA identification for now. So one of the ways in which we discover the plants of a region, say we're doing the flora of an area, is we go in the field and look for things that we haven't seen before. We also go to areas where people haven't been before. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But there's sort of two ways of collecting that botanists in particular tend to use. They tend to either go somewhere where someone has found something that they want to see, so go back to somewhere where someone's been before, or you deliberately go places where no one has been before and collected. And that way you expand not only your knowledge of what's out there, but also where things are distributed, which is extremely important as well. But actually, not all discoveries, in fact, most discoveries now, are not made in the field. They're actually made in collections, like the ones that are held here in the Beatty Biodiversity Museum. There are treasures in these collections. And a recent study that was done by some colleagues of mine, well, not recent anymore, it's 2010, so that's kind of a long time ago, showed that on average, plant species are described 70 years after they were first collected. So many, many things are new species, are in our collections, waiting for people to go and find them and look at them, which is why it's important. Lauren laughs that I went to look at the herbarium first thing, but I always expect to find something amazing, and I always do, because they are treasure chests of interesting things. And this is just one example of something I found in a herbarium. When I was doing my PhD, I had one collection from a place in Cundinamarca, which is near Bogota in Colombia. I knew it was new, I knew it was different to anything else, and I had one crummy specimen that didn't have any flowers, and it had one fruit and a few leaves, and it was just, you can't really describe something from something that's not quite good enough to tell what it really looks like. And I was in Paris, and in the old days, Paris had these huge ladders. And I was up on the top of one of these ladders going through the material that was unidentified in the genus that I was working on, unidentified nightshades. And I pulled out this specimen. And this specimen says Santa Fe de Bogota, which is Bogota in Cundinamarca in Colombia. And it was collected by Humboldt and Bonpland, who were in Colombia in 1805, which meant it had sat in the unidentified cupboards in the Paris herbarium for 200 years until I found it and recognized it as the same thing as the one specimen I had. And we described it with Colombian colleagues and named it after Alexander von Humboldt because it was just such a good story. So those kinds of things happen all the time. And I think probably of the 10 or 15 species that I've described recently, 2/3 of those have been found in the herbarium and not in the field. So it's pretty common. So going in the field is fun, though, and going in the field is really interesting. But where do you go? Where do you go in the field? How do you decide where to go? How do you know where no one has ever been before? So with a postdoc of mine, we had a grant to look at the diversity of nightshades in the country of Peru. Peru is one of the mega diverse countries in the world. Fantastically interesting. It's the hotbed of, there's 60 endemic species of potato in Peru that occur nowhere else but Peru. So we decided to do this in a logical way, to look at exploring Peru in a way such that we would maximize the possibility that we would go somewhere and find something different. So what we did is we went to, there were 253 native species in Peru. There's now 264 because we've described some more. We looked at about 15,000 at that time collections in 65 different herbaria. So we went to all these different collections all over the world and looked at these. And we then georeferenced everything and mapped it. And we then did distribution models to look at where we would expect to find endemic species based on where they did already occur, that no one had collected them yet. And that's where the red spots are, and that's where we decided to go. So we had a collecting period of 2 years where we went to Peru and went to all kinds of strange, out-of-the-way places. And these are a couple of, this is Tina Sarkinen and Maria Baden, who were the two people with whom I did this work. And we went and collected all kinds of things, found new records, found new species, partly because we were going to places which were not the normal places that people went to find things. We deliberately went to different places. But what we also did, and this is equally as important as going into different places as in the field, is to really know the plants of a country, or the insects of a country, or the vertebrates, or anything. You need to go to the collections in that country. A colleague of mine once told me, she said, well, if you go to the Natural History Museum in London, and Kew Gardens, and Missouri Botanical Garden in New York, that's it. You just basically don't have to go to any other collections because you'll get most of the things that you need to see will be in those really big collections. In fact, she's absolutely wrong. Because going to small collections that are local, that collect the flora of an area, means you gain huge amounts in knowledge of distribution and also of habitat and all kinds of other things which you miss in these really big collections. And we're right now, this is Maria databasing in a rather uncomfortable position in a herbarium that smelled a lot of naphthalene in Peru. We all had terrible headaches at the end of this and probably poisoned for life. But we're now doing a rarefaction analysis to see how much each of these small collections added to our complete data set. And they don't tend to add species. You get most of the species from the big collections. But what you get from the little local collections is local distribution and real environmental information that doesn't come with these bigger collections. So this is equally as important. So these are our results. Here's Selenum in Peru. These are all the collections which we mapped. Interestingly, the Amazon, as usual, is the least well-known part, but it's also, as you'll see, not the most interesting bit. And so we did all these analyses using the data that we collected from all of these collections, including all of these local Peruvian collections. And you can look at the numbers of collections, and if you look there, the red dots mean that's the highest number of collections. And what you'll notice is that there's one around Lima, which is the capital of Peru. There's one around Cusco, where everybody goes to look at Machu Picchu, and there's another one in Pasco, which is a town called Huancayo, which is a big mining town where many, many people went and collected in the 19th and early 20th century. When you look at species richness, Lima disappears, and you tend to get the three spots along the back slopes, the eastern slopes of the Andes, which are by far the richest areas in the world for plants. And then when you look at endemism, so an endemic is a plant that grows nowhere else. So if we're doing the flora of Peru, we're interested in endemics, things that only grow in Peru. And as I said, there's 60 endemic species of potato in Peru. When you look at endemism, you can see that the endemism hotspots, the red spots, are actually not on that species richness side of the Andes, not on the eastern slope of the Andes where all the species are. The species that occur nowhere else are on the western slopes of the Andes in the Atacama Desert, which is actually a really interesting thing. And then if you look at the almost endemics, it spreads out a little bit more. So doing that was possible. To look at the patterns of richness and endemism was possible only by firstly going in the field, but also by examining collections from all kinds of local herbaria, which is important for distribution, as I said. So the other thing that one can do with collections and with knowing the collections and knowing the flora of an area is you can look at where you might find something. So this is a species that we described as new. It's called Selenum pseudo-americanum because it looks a bit like something called Selenum americanum, which is the world's commonest Selenum and hideously boring, but this one's rather cute. We found it down here where the squares are. And so what we did as part of a course we were giving at the National Herbarium in Peru is we did distribution modeling, we did niche modeling to look where we might expect to find this species in the future. Because oftentimes what people will do, what we do, is we would just find something new, we'll describe it, and we've only collected it in one place, so it's critically endangered at the time of description. Because we've only seen it once, right? So of course it's critically endangered. But if you model where you might find it, then sure enough, it looks like it should occur in northern Peru. The next year we went to those places, and that's where we found Selenum pseudo-americanum, exactly where it should be according to our niche models. So doing that kind of modeling with things when you first collect them is actually really important to figuring out whether something really is critically endangered or whether we have just overlooked it, which is often the case, and it's hiding in herbaria. But that's only possible, again, by examining these collections and doing the derivative work of working in the local area. So in a paper that a colleague of mine, Robert Hart, wrote about looking at phenology of rhododendrons in the Himalayas, he pointed out that in this era of rapid climate change, natural history collections are actually increasingly important. They're more important now than they ever have been because they hold the data from the past. And so therefore, strengthening specimen collection, curation, and data availability should be a priority for everyone. Because it's only by having those collections well curated, well looked after, collecting more, and actually making those data available that we can do anything like use them to look at patterns of change with our changing climate. Collections also have other threats, though, as well. This is the roof of the herbarium at the Natural History Museum in London on the 11th of September 1942, the morning after it was hit with 6 incendiary bombs. So the incendiary bombs went through the roof of the herbarium. Herbaria, if anyone knows, are basically dry plants mounted on paper, and they're a fire waiting to happen. Fortunately, though, London has a climate somewhat like Vancouver, and it was raining. And so therefore, nothing caught on fire, but everything got very, very wet. And so we have a lot of remounted specimens that say, specimen damaged in enemy action, 10th of September, 1942. So that's a big risk. We were lucky. The Berlin herbarium was not so lucky. It was hit by Allied bombing in 1943 and burned to the ground with all of the specimens in it. So these collections, although they look quite robust and they feel robust in their cabinets, they're actually very precious and worth looking after extremely carefully. There are other risks from using collections, and this is Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was a friend of Darwin's, and this is his map which he used for the Flora of British India. Now, the Flora of British India was written in the late 19th century, and Hooker had an army of local collectors out collecting in India to figure out what plants were in the country of India. He didn't allow the collectors to put the names of villages on the labels because he was trying to establish the science of plant geography. So all that people were allowed to put on the labels were his preconceived biogeographic units. So whole thousands and thousands and thousands of plant specimens have no information on them other than Gangetic Plain, Carnatic, Coromandel, Malabar. That's all the information they have. So it's a huge data set which is lost to science because the data aren't available. People knew where they were collecting, it's just they weren't allowed to put it on the label. So I think that's a tragic loss, almost as tragic as the herbarium having burned down. We can still look at the morphology of those things, but we can't do anything else. We can't use them to model, we can't use them to predict where something else might be found. And one of the things about collections is that they're a way for us to predict. They allow us to predict that something would occur somewhere. So collections for the new floras, so if we're going to do floras in the future, if we're looking at studying the plants of an area, they need to maybe be traditional specimens. Photographs are really nice. DNA extractable material is fantastic if you can get permission to get it. You can also collect common species with photographs alone, if you have DNA extractable material as well, because that's another set of characteristics that you can use. Just photographs are extremely important and very, very useful. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. You can just collect DNA extractable material. Many small insects, the whole thing is the DNA extractable material. You don't get much left over after you've had something very, very tiny. But what's really important about collecting now that people didn't realize before is to actually georeference collections so that you know exactly where they were collected. So you can either go back or you can use that information together with environmental variables to be able to predict things into the future. And also sharing such information widely and digitally so that people can reuse it and put it together in all kinds of different ways is quite important as well. So one of the great things that happened since I became a taxonomist is the advent of big digital databases which allow people to share information, and it also allows us to aggregate huge amounts of information about biodiversity of all sorts and put it together, and out of that new patterns emerge that we never even thought of asking the question to see if there was such a pattern in the first place. So we can think of lots of questions, but sometimes big data sets allow us to think of new questions, or even new questions come out that we never even thought to ask. And that's what's really exciting about all of these data. But actually, people are really important as well. There still is always the people question. And if we're looking at the flora of an area, the people in an area are critically important. In 2005, for the UK government, I did an analysis of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments biodiversity synthesis, and I needed to pull out the messages for them. And this, for me, was the single most important message of the entire Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which essentially looked at the state of our planet at the turn of the millennium. And they said that the major obstacle to knowing, valuing, preserving, and using sustainably biodiversity of a country is human and institutional capacity to research that country's biota. Now, when countries signed the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992, biodiversity and all of its products went from being a global human good, the global commons, to being the patrimony of nations. And countries felt that they owned that biodiversity which is within their borders. And in a way, a country does own the biodiversity within its borders. They certainly have responsibility for it, and with that responsibility comes a lot of, well, responsibility, doesn't it? But actually, this human and institutional capacity to research the country's biota is something that people forgot about in this rush to nationalize biodiversity. So, another colleague of mine, Luke Joppa, published a paper in Trends in Ecology Evolution in 2011. And they said, well, what are all these taxonomists complaining about? You know, taxonomists complained for a long time that there's no taxonomists anymore. We're a dying breed. There's no one like us. No one can describe new plants and animals anymore. So they looked at the number of taxonomists, and their number of taxonomists is the number of people who are describing new species of organisms. So that was their surrogate for number of taxonomists. And they looked at that through time, from 1753 to the year 2005. And what they found was completely contrary to what everyone thought the case was. What they found is that the number of taxonomists was going up year on year. Now, as a taxonomist and working in taxonomy, I know that there are fewer taxonomists now than there were 100 years ago. But maybe it's because there are more taxonomists, but each of us is doing less taxonomy as part of our jobs. So we're each doing things in a different way. So we're doing more different things. This curve is going up. The number of new plant species described every year has remained at 2,000 new plant species, vascular plant species, flowering plants, 2,000 per year for the last 4 decades. So the number we're describing is completely constant. So that means there has to be another curve here, which means that the number of plant species each taxonomist is describing is going down. So it's logical there are more taxonomists if the number is remaining the same. But I also think this has to do with the way in which we're working as taxonomists. Is we work much more together in groups of people who come together to look at the taxonomy, the flora of an area, to monograph a group. We look at things in a much more collective way, rather than being a single man, and it's always a man, sitting in his office with a microscope waiting to publish his single monograph at the end of his career. We tend to work much more in groups, and not just in the field. This also is true for publication. So many more papers are being published by multiple authors. So multiple authors are working together to look at describing new species. And what I think is really an encouraging trend, and this is data we're just analyzing now, is that actually the numbers of taxonomists, the number of people involved in this endeavor who are from what is now called the Global South, which used to be called the developing world, is increasing all the time. So it may be that in the developed world, like Europe, the United States, Canada, the number of taxonomists is going down, but the number of taxonomists where biodiversity is going up. And that is extremely encouraging, because I think that's a really good sign for the future. But we still live in little bubbles. This is a map of scientific interaction. So this is a map of co-authorship of papers around the world. And the colors are interactions. And you can see that we still have bubbles of interaction where we only interact. It's not all the same color. There's still areas of which we interact in a different way. So that means that we still exist in these bubbles where we aren't truly globalized. But actually, I want to just give an example of a project which I think is inspiring and exciting. And this is the flora of Brazil. So Brazil is a huge country. It's 8.5 million kilometers squared. It's absolutely gargantuan. I think it has probably 32 to 35,000 species of vascular plants within its borders. So something like 50% of the world's plant diversity is in Brazil. So that's a big task. The last Flora of Brazil was published by Carl Philipp von Martius in the middle of the 19th century. And there's been no flora of Brazil since then. So the Brazilian botanical community got together and they thought, well, what should we do? What should we we do about flora of Brazil? This is a daunting task. So they decided, right, we're going to do this by 2020. We're going to do our flora completely by 2020. And so they pulled together groups of people, led always by Brazilian botanists, to do the flora of Brazil completely online. So the flora will be done completely electronically. It's all done online. It's done by teams of people. All the teams have targets. And we've just published our third big update, at which we're almost 50% done with the flora of Brazil now, which is pretty exciting to think that it is a huge amount of neotropical, of all of plant diversity on the globe. And a group of botanists just got together and said, we will do this. We're going to do this. This is important for us as a nation to know our flora, to know what plants we have within our borders, because how can we sustainably use and sustainably conserve that diversity unless we know what's there? And I think it's a great achievement of theirs to have done this. So this is a few pages from the flora of Brazil, and it just grows by leaps and bounds. It's worth taking a look at. There are bits in English and bits in Portuguese and bits in Spanish. It's in all kinds of different languages. It's very inspiring. But what's important about the flora of Brazil is it's being done by botanists, and it's being done by people who are trained taxonomists, specialists like me and Jeanette, who are specialists in particular areas of botany. But doing the flora of an area, knowing the plants of an area, isn't only the province of people who are trained taxonomists. Because we all know that we go out into nature and look at things, and we can recognize species, we can recognize organisms. We too observe all kinds of plants that are in our environment. And people are interested in natural history. As countries become more developed and people are less concerned with the day-to-day struggle to feed themselves, there's space and time to become interested in the world around, and to become interested in a slightly more disinterested sort of way. And this is where I think that floras need to go, is that floras, or the description of the plant, and it could be animal, diversity within an area, needs to be done not just by scientists, but by everyone, because it means something to everyone. It means it's important to everyone, and it impacts on everyone's lives. And with the advent of the internet, we have crowdsourcing platforms like Zooniverse was one of the first ones, and this was first established for people to look for stars. So can you imagine, rather than setting up an internet platform for people to look for new taxa of organisms, the first one of these was to look for new stars in the galaxy, new stars and new galaxies. So we're kind of more interested in worlds beyond ours than in the one that we inhabit, which is a teeny bit ironic, but things are changing. So Zooniverse, things like iSpot, iNaturalist, which is one of the big ones here in North America, are these platforms where people can share information about the natural world. And they are places where everyone is equal. It's a level playing field. So I, as a taxonomist, can go in here and say, yes, I think that's that species. But other people have an opinion as well. And it allows open sharing of information and creates a kind of community. The iSpot for South Africa has got the strongest and most amazing community of people working on it. It's quite exciting to be part of it. There are also missions to transcribe herbarium specimens. So I've been databasing specimens in the herbarium here, transcribing them into the database so I can then use them in my models to look at where the edges of ranges go. But imagine a collection like Paris. Paris has 12 million herbarium specimens. I think the herbarium here has 200,000, about?
Vascular.
Yeah, vascular plants. Paris has 12 million. That's a huge, we calculate how many years it would take us to transcribe all of that information into databases, and it'll take hundreds of people, hundreds of years. So why not harness the power of people who are interested to do this? And Les Aeronauts is a mission to transcribe herbarium specimens. And there's been a lot of experience in Europe with transcribing information. And what people are the most interested in transcribing, and you can imagine that this is probably true, People are most interested in transcribing things that have to do with other people. So the easiest things to get transcribed are birth and death records from cities and villages. So the Dutch birth and death records were recently digitized and put out for transcription. And huge cities would have the entire birth and death records transcribed within about a couple of months, partly because people were looking for their relatives in there. So we all need to have a relative to botanist, actually, to be able to really want to transcribe these herbarium records quickly. And we had a project that we tried from a different tack. So instead of just putting things out there, we thought, let's ask a scientific question and see if we can get people who are not trained taxonomists, just anybody, to participate with us in this adventure to answer this question. So the question we asked was that, is climate change affecting the blooming times in the UK's orchids? Now, the United Kingdom is an absolutely minutely tiny country. I mean, it is so small that we actually don't know plants by species names, we know them by individuals. So there's Bob and Dave and Jeff and Sam. We know, and orchids more than anything else. And orchids there's huge numbers of orchid enthusiasts. So we had a kind of three-parted program, one of which was to transcribe herbarium specimens, of which we have thousands of orchid specimens from the British Isles. Strangely, for people who love orchids so much, the first thing orchid lovers in the British Isles tended to do in the 19th century is they would rip them up and make herbarium specimens of them, which is a bit sad. But we needed to transcribe those, and also people to go out and photograph orchids and record their blooming times all over the country. And this was successful beyond our wildest dreams. We had almost 2,000 contributors to this in one season, so this is one orchid blooming season. More than 50,000 additional data points, and people participated from the Shetland Isles in the north all the way down to the Scilly Isles in the south. So we had people participating from all over the country, and people were photographing orchids, and it got to be a really fun community to interact with. And people are just analyzing the data now, but what we thought was really interesting is people often say that these citizen science projects, or projects in which people who are not necessarily trained to do something, just produce data which is not really usable scientifically, that this is just something to get people interested. But actually, from this project, we had more than 200 new sites, new records for localities for orchids in the British Isles, which is astounding considering we know our flora so well. And we also had really high quality scientific data that actually fit in and filled in gaps in the data that we had. And there was also a huge amount of knowledge sharing across communities. So different communities have different ways of keeping, sharing, and disseminating the knowledge that they have. And when you interact with a different community, the knowledge systems that you use and the sharing that you do can be incredibly powerful to not only impart knowledge, but to receive knowledge from people who are not just like you. And I think that's one of the really important things about citizen science, is it's not just about scientists telling citizens what to do. It's about co-creating something that actually benefits everyone. And that's what I think is really exciting about the citizen science movement as it's developing now. So why does this matter, and why are all these collections important? Why is knowing the flora of your area important? Well, the adage from the Convention on Biological Diversity was that you needed to think globally and act locally. And a flora is a perfect way of acting locally. It's knowing the plants of your area. And I think in the future we have to go beyond the caricature of the taxonomist of the past, who is that man with his beard, sitting with his beetles, working his entire life to produce one thing that only people who have sat in their office for their entire lives working on their beetles will ever read. So that kind of seems a bit closed. That seems like a closed circle, isn't it? So actually, these collections, all that, needs to be seen as something different. We need to move to a model that's more like physics. So this is the team from the University of Manchester who were involved in discovering the Higgs boson. My father was a physicist, so we used to have family arguments about who had the more difficult job. Mine, which is to describe 1.5 million organisms on the planet, or his, which is to find one thing. I still argue mine is harder. His needs bigger kit and more people. So biologists have often contrasted themselves to physicists. Physicists work in these great big teams. And biologists have often said, well, that's because they have big infrastructures. They have these big infrastructures like CERN or the Large Hadron Collider or the Tevatron at Fermilab. But I would argue, actually, that the collections that we have and the global consortia of collections are an infrastructure which is every bit as important and every bit as complex as the kinds of machines that physicists use to discover particles of matter. So here's our herbarium, and there's the Large Tevatron, and I think I'd rather be working in the herbarium. Thank you very much. And so floras actually represent the results of the use of an infrastructure. And infrastructure might not sound very sexy, but infrastructures are essential for doing good science, for doing good big science. And a flora, a catalogue of the plants of an area, a catalogue of the plants of British Columbia, the plants of Canada, the plants of Mesoamerica, is nothing if not big science. It's equally big science with the physics of the science that goes on at places like CERN. So floras of the future, in my view, have to be electronic, they have to be multimedia, fast-moving, they'll never be complete. This is a moving target. Evolution is happening as we speak. They need to be incremental and maybe modular, but most of all, they have to be inclusive. They need to involve not just scientists, but everybody. And they also need to be flexible, which means we need to think about their uses beyond just the narrow community. People like me need to think about uses beyond just their narrow community. So that's very different to the floras of the past. And this is important because, as one of our government chief scientists once says, we are now approaching the perfect storm. We're living at a time when change is happening faster than we could possibly imagine. Work that's done by Johannes Rockström in the Stockholm Resilience Institute has shown that for biodiversity and climate change, we're already living well beyond our planetary boundaries. And this is partly because of the uncertainty. We don't know what would happen if we lost all the biodiversity. It's likely it would be catastrophic, but the uncertainty of what would happen should that happen is something that we just don't know. And a colleague of mine, Andy Purvis, and his group have been working using a program called, a project they have called Predicts, which is an acronym for something I can never remember what it is. But they've shown that in all these different types of habitats, all these different biomes, using two of the main measures of biodiversity, species abundance and species richness, is that everything, almost everything, is beyond those safe limits. So, and grasslands are the most affected of all. So we're living beyond the safe limits for a sustainable planet already. So what do we do about that in the future? And the world is changing all the time, and I think we need to discover the world, catalog the world, and use that information. As the Convention on Biological Diversity has three pillars to it. It has the conservation of biological diversity, its sustainable use, and probably most importantly, the fair and equitable sharing of its benefits. So two of those planks of the Convention on Biological Diversity are about us, the human species, and they give us the responsibility for doing something about the planet on which we live. This is a picture that was taken in 2010. If I had the same one from now, there would be less forest and more farms. So, because people always say things better than I can say them myself, I want to end with a couple of what I think are my quotes from people from the past who have said something that really strikes a chord with me. And the first is from Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection with Charles Darwin, and was probably one of the greatest naturalists ever to live. And he said, we should look on every species now living as individual letters which go to make up one of the volumes of our Earth's history, and as a few lost letters may make a sentence unintelligible, so the extinction of numerous forms of life will necessarily render obscure this record of the past. And even more scary, future ages will certainly look back upon us as a people so immersed in the pursuit of wealth as to be blind to higher considerations. They will charge us with culpably allowing the destruction of that which we hid in our power to conserve, seeing many species perish irrecoverably, uncared for and unknown. And he wrote those words in 1863. And they're as true now, today, as they were when he wrote them. And that's actually an indictment on us as a human species that we haven't really taken to heart, that we need to work harder to conserve what we have. We don't need to go the way of the Maya, who basically became extinct. And Teddy Roosevelt also said something which I think is important to remember, is do not let selfish men or greedy interests skin your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance. And that there's something that's important, is that part of understanding biodiversity or studying biodiversity is not just knowing it and making a list. It's also the romance and the beauty of knowing that we share the planet with so many extraordinary other forms of life. And we conserve only those things we know about. And we know about only those things which we are taught. And cataloging plant and animal life is one way of knowing what other organisms we share the earth with. So doing that description is one of the most important things we can do to start us on the journey to actually cherishing not only our country, but also our planet. And so the adage to think globally and act locally almost needs to be turned on its head. We need to also think locally, but act globally. To think about what's in our local area and think about how we conserve that, how we catalog that, how we work with that, which then fits into a global picture, which allows us to become one more piece in perhaps creating a sustainable planet for our descendants.